Yes, I shall try to, the paradox of freedom. And let me start by saying that there are several paradoxes, freedom being such a complex and contested concept. However, I will depart from 3 points. First, the conflict of goals between freedom on the one hand and security and welfare on the other. Second, how we can understand this conflict of goals through Katarina Barrling's distinction between positive and negative freedom. And third, how the contemporary refusal to accept the conflict of goals is manifested in the view of human rights. Throughout the discussion, I will link these issues to religion and also to the worst capital vice, pride. First, then, the conflict of goals between freedom and security and welfare. I would like to start with a line in Swedish that I will translate later, and it is "Ack libertas, du ädla ting," or in English, "O liberty, thou noble thing." These are the words of a Swedish 17th century poet, Lars Vivallius, from his poem with the same title as the quote, "O liberty, thou noble thing." The spirit of the poem is that freedom is the ultimate form of happiness, and that it is better to be free and poor in the wilderness than to sit locked up in a golden cage. The classical image of Vivallius is that of a carefree adventurer, a wanderer who repeatedly found himself behind bars, that is, Swedish prison. And the cages he was placed in were certainly not golden. But there, locked up, he wrote beautiful songs about freedom and about the Swedish nature. But Vivallius was also a rogue who, among other things, adopted noble names and created false coats of arms to obtain credit and loans and to gain access to les salons of the noble classes. Vivallius may have been a social counterfeiter, but his poem is genuine and true in the sense that it touches upon humanity's longing for freedom and the eternal conflict of goals between freedom on the one hand and welfare and security on the other. One might say that this conflict of goals lays the foundation for Western civilization. Here I think of the book of Genesis, where Adam and Eve, as we have been told, choose the freedom to choose and choose to eat from the tree of knowledge. They choose freedom over obedience to God. One might say that Adam and Eve's sin consists of, from a religious perspective, a misguided pursuit of freedom. As Matthäus put it, "I don't want everything, I just want this one apple." A kind of early wokeism, one might perhaps say. But not just that. In addition, an astonishing lack of gratitude, an expression of pride. From this perspective, it is understandable that humility became an important Christian virtue. By this choice, in a superficial formal sense, humans become free, but at the same time they lose all the security and prosperity they enjoyed in paradise. A proud poet like Vivallius and his rebellious colleagues throughout literary history, especially romantics, perhaps also Torbjörn, would think that they thereby leave a kind of golden cage. During the 17th century of Vivallius, this century of hardship, warfare, and death, we find many thinkers and artists who pondered the tension between freedom and security. The foremost, according to many, is the philosopher Thomas Hobbes. His idea about the conflict of goals between freedom and security is presented in his book from 1651, Leviathan. According to Hobbes, in a state of nature lacking a formal state and laws and where people enjoy complete freedom, anarchy and the war of all against all will prevail. This war may be derived to human passions or appetites such as pride, self-love, and envy. So, people will hand over power to an authority, the state. This state, Leviathan, has complete power. The state guarantees security for the people, and in return, the people give up the freedom they enjoyed in the state of nature. Or rather, according to Hobbes' grim perspective, the freedom they suffered from in the state of nature. One might see Hobbes' bleak message as a secular, constitutional counterpart to the message of the Old Testament. But with Hobbes, it is not God, but the state that promises security. In exchange, people will give up their freedom. Notice here that the symbol of the all-powerful state, Leviathan, is a biblical monster resembling a snake. That's certainly a twist with Hobbes. Regardless of the connection between freedom and sins or vices, it is an extremely risky venture. Freedom may be ever so tempting, but it has terrible consequences, at worst the civil war in Britain that Hobbes himself witnessed. Western society is thus a culture where one of the mental cornerstones is an understanding of human freedom, in the sense I described, as associated with sin, and alongside that, great risks. At the same time, just as the Swedish poet Vivaldius, Western society sees freedom as the noblest of things. Today, more than ever, at least we pay lip service to freedom. The high status of freedom means that even those who oppose freedom claim to be the supporters of freedom. The restraints they nevertheless put on people are justified by their claims that the real purpose is for people to gain greater freedom. They simply have to force people to be free. Such double bookkeeping is usually associated with authoritarian regimes. However, a quite similar approach could also be found within Western democracy. We will come back to that, but first, to unravel this naughty attitude toward freedom, let's have a closer look at the philosopher Katarina Barrling and his distinction between positive and negative freedom. Negative freedom, according to Barrling, first, means freedom from coercion, that is, freedom from physical and legal barriers and from oppression from outside. Here, the essence of freedom lies in the individual's independence from others and external forces. Positive freedom, on the other hand, requires more. Positive freedom is the freedom to be able to fulfill oneself, in contrast to negative freedom, which does not necessarily mean the faculty to achieve one's potential or desires. Barrling does not reject positive freedom. He recognizes it as one human value among others, but he also points out that the idea of positive freedom can be pursued in such a way that it becomes authoritarian, thus a threat to negative freedom. Those who claim to represent the collective freedom to be realized, for example, may argue that individuals need to give up their freedom to gain a higher form of freedom. Communism's idea that man cannot fulfill himself until he is liberated from the capitalist system can be seen as another example. We find it in all kinds of authoritarian movements wanting to define what is paradise and to force humanity back there. However, we can also encounter this confusion of negative and positive freedom in democratic systems. It is as if the modern liberal democracy does not really want to acknowledge the conflict of goals between freedom on one hand and the security and welfare on the other, nor, as we've heard today, the need for character nor virtue in order to obtain security and prosperity. One could argue that in the contemporary view of human rights, HR, we find this confusion. In the modern liberal democracy, human rights are as close to the sacred as a secular society can get. Human rights have come to be seen as an eternal universal truth that does not need to be justified. They just exist, and they are, by definition, virtuous, even though the word is seldom heard nowadays. In his book, The Last Utopia, Samuel Moyne, professor of history at Columbia University, writes, "Historians of human rights approach their subject the way church historians once approached theirs. They regard the basic cause, much as the church historian treated the Christian religion, as a saving truth, discovered rather than made in history." However, the growing scope of human rights has come under question. The critics argue that the dogmatic stance that now encompasses the issue may even counteract its purpose and place obstacles in the way of those working for democracy and freedom. One critic is Aaron Rhodes, serving as executive director of the Helsinki Foundation for Human Rights for 14 years, a true HR activist. No one can question his genuine commitment to human rights. He presents his critique in his book from 2018, The Debasement of Human Rights, How Politics Sabotage the Ideal of Freedom. Rhodes' main argument is that protecting human rights is primarily about protecting negative freedom. That is, a concern about what states are not allowed to do, for example, violate individual dignity or security. According to Rhodes, human rights are at the very core linked to negative freedom. True human rights compel governments not to infringe on individual liberty. They do not require positive actions to change society. They do not lay the foundation for positive liberty, such as education or a good workplace. Yet, today, human rights have increasingly lost their original meaning: to protect the individual from the state. Instead, more and more of the idea of positive freedom has come to be included into the HR concept. Social and economic rights, such as housing, education, and a good workplace. What happened was that concurrently with the adoption of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights in 1966, the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights was also adopted. The latter was thus focused on positive freedom. Driving this process was the Soviet bloc. When criticized for not respecting negative freedom, it could now counter the criticism by highlighting what it did for citizens' positive freedom. That is, the right to house and housing, and so on. One might think that this development ceased with the fall of communism. It did not. On the contrary, since then, the UN has pushed efforts to bring together negative and positive rights into a cohesive cluster, where all human rights are universal, indivisible, and interdependent and interrelated. Paradoxically, expanded rights thus mean that the overall status of human rights weakens. This is particularly serious since the more fundamental human rights, freedom from abuse and coercion, that is negative freedom, also lose value. States that do not take into account negative freedom can also more easily cover up the discrepancy by highlighting the respect for extensive social and economic rights, that is positive freedom. They can hide their sin against negative freedom behind the virtues of positive freedom, just as the Soviet Union once did. And to conclude, the tendency to inflate the concept of human rights display a contemporary refusal to accept the fundamental conflict of goals between freedom on the one hand and security and welfare on the other. A desire to have the cake and to eat it. A desire to move out of paradise, but at the same time be able to take refuge there, whenever it's convenient. From a Christian perspective, we might call it ingratitude. From a secular perspective, we might call it a refusal to accept the reality, that reality follows a certain logic. From both perspectives, we might even call it pride. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, linking this to virtue at the very, very end. Could you expand a little more on this link between freedom and virtue?
Well, I would say that there's some sort of, as I said, wanting to have the cake and eat it. We want to have full freedom, but still we do not want to make the sacrifice that it demands. And we never see that, well, to obtain freedom in this sense, also combined with welfare and prosperity, we might have to, as been said here today, to cultivate more virtues. So, but we don't want that. We want both. We want to take the discussion now in Sweden. We want to change our sex whenever we want. We want to have that right, but we don't want to pay the price. For example, I heard a discussion here on the radio with a Swedish doctor who said that, well, now this demands for the hospitals to offer all kinds of services to these people. They get, if they used to be a man and now think they're a woman, they might say, now I have women's diseases also. So there's a sacrifice tied to freedom, and I would say also a sacrifice tied to prosperity and welfare. But in this world, we want everything all the time without the trade-offs and without cultivating the virtues to obtain all these good things.
Could we go as far as say a free person is a virtuous person?
In
No.
some of the senses,
if the answer is no, don't try.
Might be. Depending on the definition. Yes, thank you.